The content in this video is based on factual, real-life events and public records. All opinions expressed are for educational and documentary purposes only. Viewer discretion is advised, as some scenes may depict sensitive content. This video is intended for informative purposes and complies with YouTube's guidelines. The switch was thrown, and everyone in the room believed it was over. The witnesses had already been told what they were about to see. The officials were trained to look calm. The law had done this before, many times. But this time, the body on the execution device did not go still. Minutes passed, then more minutes. A doctor leaned forward. A guard looked away. Someone whispered words that were never supposed to be spoken inside that room. He's still alive. This was not a movie. This was not a rumor. This was real. In the United States and the United Kingdom, there have been moments when the death penalty failed. Moments when the state tried to carry out an execution, followed every rule on paper, and still did not succeed. The person sentenced to die survived the process that was meant to end everything. What happens when the government tries to kill you and fails? Are you legally dead? Can they try again? Or has the law crossed a line it cannot uncross? This story begins at that exact moment, when the execution was already supposed to be finished, but the condemned person was still breathing, still aware, still trapped inside a system that had no clear answer for what came next. Because surviving your own execution does not mean freedom. Sometimes, it means something far more terrifying. If you enjoy real, gripping prison documentaries and true stories, don't forget to like this video, leave a comment, and share it with your friends and family. Hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss more shocking and exclusive content. The story did not begin in the execution room. It began years earlier, inside courtrooms where the word death was spoken calmly, as if it were just another sentence on a page. In 1946, in Louisiana, a 17-year-old boy named Willie Francis stood in front of a judge. He was poor. He had little education. He barely understood the legal words being used around him. He was convicted of murder after a rushed trial, with weak legal defense and no real chance to fight back. When the judge sentenced him to death, Willie did not react the way people expect. He did not scream. He did not beg. He simply stood there, silent, while his future was decided in minutes. Louisiana used the electric chair. At the time, officials claimed it was fast and reliable. They called it progress. Willie was sent to Angola prison to wait. Death row was not dramatic. It was long stretches of nothing. A small cell. Fixed meal times. Guards walking past without looking at his face. Willie passed the days listening to footsteps and doors. He scratched marks into the wall to count time. He prayed some nights. Other nights, he just lay awake, staring at the ceiling, wondering how the world could move on while his own had stopped. When the date finally came, Willie was taken from his cell and walked down a quiet hallway. He was strapped into the electric chair, leather restraints across his arms, chest, and legs. A metal cap placed on his head. Witnesses watched from behind glass. Officials stood ready. Everything was supposed to go exactly as planned. It didn't. When the switch was thrown, the chair malfunctioned. The electricity did not work the way it was meant to. Instead of instant death, Willie cried out. His body reacted. He was alive. The execution was stopped in panic. Guards rushed in. Doctors stepped forward. After moments that felt too long, Willie was removed from the chair. He had survived his execution. Willie was taken back to his cell, shaken and terrified. He believed something had changed. That what happened meant the state could not try again. That surviving meant the law had reached its limit. He was wrong. The state of Louisiana announced they would schedule another execution. Willie's lawyers appealed, arguing that forcing him to face death a second time was cruel and unconstitutional. The case went all the way to the United States Supreme Court. In 1947, the court ruled against Willie Francis. They said the first execution attempt did not count. They said the state was allowed to try again. 1 year later, Willie Francis was executed successfully. His case became one of the most disturbing examples in American legal history. Not because of the crime alone, but because the system admitted it had failed once and still insisted on finishing the job. Decades passed, but the problem did not disappear. In 2009, in Ohio, Romell Broom was scheduled to die by lethal injection. By then, lethal injection had replaced older methods. Officials described it as calm, medical, and controlled. The public was told it was humane. On the day of his execution, Romell was brought into the chamber. Witnesses watched through glass. The execution team tried to insert in 4-line. They couldn't find a vein. They tried again and again. Minutes passed. Then an hour. Romell cried out in pain and fear. His arms were examined repeatedly. Officials whispered. Doctors were consulted. After nearly 2 hours, the governor ordered the execution stopped. Romell Broom was returned to his cell alive. Just like Willie Francis, Romell believed surviving meant something had changed. But Ohio announced they intended to try again. Romell fought back in court, arguing that a second execution attempt would violate the Constitution. The legal battle dragged on for years. Judges disagreed. Appeals were filed. Dates were discussed and delayed. Romell lived every day knowing the state still planned to kill him. In 2020, Romell Broom died in prison from natural causes before a second execution attempt could take place. His case reopened old wounds and new debates. In the United Kingdom and Canada, stories like these were used as powerful evidence against the death penalty. Both countries had already abolished capital punishment, arguing that no justice system could be perfect enough to make death irreversible. Lawmakers pointed to failed executions as proof that even when the state followed its own rules, people could still suffer in ways the law never truly addressed. But in parts of the United States, executions continued. Each failed attempt left behind a living person in a cell, trapped between life and death, waiting to find out if the system would come back for them again. Surviving execution did not bring relief. It brought uncertainty. It meant living with the knowledge that the state had already decided you should be dead and was willing to try again. For inmates on death row, the question spread quietly from cell to cell, passed through lawyers, and whispered through walls. If the state fails once, how many times can it try again? And what does that do to a person who survives? Those questions did not stay in history books. They were about to surface again, in new courtrooms, new execution chambers, and new cases that would force the world to look directly at what happens when death does not go as planned. After Willie Francis and Romell Broom, officials promised the public that those failures were rare. They said the system had learned. They said technology was better now. They said executions were controlled. But behind prison walls, a different truth was forming. In April 2014, inside the Oklahoma State Penitentiary, Clayton Lockett was brought into the execution chamber. He had been on death row for years. His body carried prison ink, rough tattoos done with homemade needles, symbols of time and anger and survival. To the state, none of that mattered anymore. The process was scheduled. Witnesses were seated. The drugs were prepared. Lethal injection was meant to be simple. Officials said the first drug would make the inmate unconscious. The second would stop breathing. The third would stop the heart. On paper, it sounded clean. But nothing went clean that night. The execution team struggled to place the 4-line. It was eventually inserted, but not where it should have been. The drugs were released. The clock started. Witnesses expected silence. Instead, Clayton moved. Not violently. Not dramatically. Just enough to signal that something was wrong. He spoke. He tried to lift his head. Officials exchanged looks. The warden ended the execution early and ordered the blinds closed. Clayton Lockett died later, but not the way the state said he would. The damage was done. For the first time in years, the public saw proof that lethal injection could fail just as badly as older methods. News spread fast across the United States, into Canada, into the UK. Legal experts began asking uncomfortable questions. If an execution goes wrong but still ends in death, does that count as a failure? And what if it doesn't end in death at all? Because some inmates didn't die. In Arizona, in 2022, Joseph Wood was executed using a drug combination that had never been tested the way the state claimed. The execution lasted far longer than expected. Officials said the process worked. Witnesses said otherwise. Lawsuits followed. Investigations stalled. The system closed ranks. And then there were the inmates who survived long enough for the state to stop. In Alabama, in 2022, Kenneth Smith was brought into the execution chamber. His execution was halted after hours of failed attempts to establish for access. He was returned to his cell alive. Alabama announced it would try again. Kenneth Smith's case reignited the question that never went away. Can the state legally attempt to kill someone twice? Courts across the U.S. have mostly said yes. The reasoning is cold and simple. An execution is considered a process, not a single moment. If the process fails due to error, the sentence remains active. The person is still legally alive and still legally sentenced to death. To the system, survival is a technical problem, not a moral one. For the inmate, it is something else entirely. After a failed execution, prisoners are not celebrated. They are not released. They are returned to their cells, often placed under watch, sometimes isolated. Guards treat them differently. Some avoid eye contact. Others stare longer than usual. Word spreads fast on death row. The man who came back becomes something else in the prison ecosystem. Lawyers step in. Appeals are filed. Media attention spikes, then fades. Meanwhile, the inmate wakes up every morning knowing the state already tried once and is preparing to try again. Psychologists who have studied these cases describe something called anticipatory trauma. The body stays in a constant state of readiness. Sleep becomes shallow. Time stretches. Some inmates stop eating. Others cling to routine. Many report that the waiting after a failed execution is worse than the waiting before the first one. In the United Kingdom, this exact fear was one of the reasons capital punishment was abolished. Lawmakers argued that the mental torture of waiting for death, especially after a failed attempt, crossed a moral line. Canada reached the same conclusion. The state could not guarantee perfection, and when the punishment was irreversible, mistakes were unacceptable. The United States chose a different path. States changed drug combinations. They altered protocols. They restricted media access. Some passed laws to hide the names of drug suppliers. Executions resumed, but the failures never fully stopped. Each time an execution was halted, delayed, or botched, the same question resurfaced in legal briefs and late-night news segments. If a person survives execution, are they being punished twice for the same crime? Courts answered with legal language. Inmates lived with the reality. For men like Kenneth Smith, survival did not bring relief. It brought a countdown reset. Alabama later announced it would execute him using a different method. The message was clear. The state would finish what it started. Across death rows in America, inmates watched these cases closely. They learned names, dates, methods. They learned that survival did not mean mercy. It meant uncertainty. And somewhere inside prison walls, a terrifying understanding settled in. Surviving execution does not make you untouchable. It makes you a problem the system feels forced to solve. And the solution, more often than not, is to try again, no matter how many times it takes. After the public attention faded, life on death row returned to its slow rhythm. But for inmates who had survived an execution attempt, nothing ever felt normal again. In Texas, lawyers began quietly reviewing older cases, looking for patterns the public had missed. They found inmates whose executions were delayed mid-procedure, halted by judges at the last minute, or stopped because equipment failed. Most people never heard their names because the state did not want those stories remembered. One of those cases involved Doyle Ham in Alabama in 2018. He had terminal cancer. The state moved forward anyway. During the execution attempt, officials were unable to establish access for hours. The process was stopped, and Ham was returned to his cell alive. He later described intense suffering. But what shook people most was what came next. Alabama announced it could attempt to execute him again. Ham's lawyers went public. Medical experts stepped in. Photos of his condition surfaced. Under pressure, the state finally agreed not to attempt another execution, not out of mercy, but because of legal risk. Doyle Ham died months later from illness, still legally sentenced to death. To the system, the sentence never changed. What happens after a failed execution is not relief. It is paperwork, new execution dates, revised protocols, legal arguments written in careful language that avoids emotion. The inmate is rarely consulted. They are informed. Inside prison walls, guards treat these inmates differently. Some see them as already dead, others as bad luck. Conversations stop when they enter a room. Meals are delivered with less eye contact. The man who survived becomes a reminder that the system is not perfect. Psychologists studying death row describe a shift after a failed execution. Before, inmates fear death. After, they fear waiting. Time stretches in unnatural ways. Every sound outside the cell feels like a signal. Sleep becomes fractured. The body reacts as if danger is always approaching, because it is. Inmates report that after surviving execution, they stop imagining the future. Birthdays mean nothing. Appeals feel hollow. Life becomes a pause between attempts. In Canada, lawmakers pointed to these exact psychological effects when defending abolition. They argued that forcing someone to prepare for death more than once was mental torture. The UK made similar arguments decades earlier, citing the inability to guarantee a clean, humane process. In the United States, courts largely disagreed. Judges ruled that a failed execution does not erase a sentence. It delays it. The logic was technical. The impact was human. By the early 2020s, states began experimenting with new methods. Nitrogen hypoxia, revised injection protocols, secrecy laws that blocked public review. Officials said these changes would prevent failures. But death row inmates watched closely. They understood something the public didn't. Every new method meant new risks, new chances for error, new possibilities of surviving something never meant to be survived. And for those who already had, the message was chillingly clear. The state would not stop because it failed. It would stop only when the body did. As legal challenges stacked up and execution dates were quietly rescheduled, one reality became unavoidable. Surviving execution did not put an inmate outside the system. It trapped them deeper inside it. And the next time the state came back, it planned to make sure there was no second mistake. By the time the next wave of execution attempts arrived, the system had grown quieter. States stopped announcing details. Media access was limited. Drug sources were hidden behind laws written to protect security. Officials said transparency caused problems. In reality, transparency showed mistakes. In 2022, Alabama scheduled another execution for Kenneth Smith. He had already survived one attempt. This time, the state said it was prepared. The method would be different. The outcome, they promised, would not be. Inside prison walls, word traveled fast. Smith had tattoos like many long-term inmates. Rough ink etched over years, marks of time rather than style. A pair of dice on his hand. Letters on his chest faded by age. Guards knew him. Inmates knew him. He was the man the state had already failed to kill once. When the date approached, his lawyers filed motions. Psychologists testified about trauma. Medical experts warned of risk. Courts listened, then denied relief. The execution was delayed, but not canceled. What stood out was not just Smith's case, but what it represented. He was no longer an exception. He was part of a pattern. In Mississippi, Arizona, and Texas, similar stories surfaced quietly. Executions paused after complications. Inmates returned to their cells alive. States responded by changing procedures rather than sentences. Survival was treated like a glitch. For prison staff, these moments created tension that never made the news. Guards were trained for control, not uncertainty. Nurses were trained to heal, not participate in death. After a failed execution, staff were rotated, reassigned, sometimes sent home early. Counseling was offered, then forgotten. The inmate remained. On death row, surviving execution changed how others looked at you. Some believed you were cursed. Others believed you were protected by something they didn't understand. Conversations shifted. People listened more carefully when you spoke, or they avoided you completely. Inmates who had not yet faced execution began to fear survival as much as death. Dying was final. Living afterward meant repeating the fear again and again. Outside prison walls, the public saw fragments. Headlines, court rulings, short clips on the evening news. What they didn't see was the waiting. Weeks turned into months. Months into years. Execution dates were announced, then postponed. Each notice forced the inmate to prepare all over again. Final phone calls, final meals, final meetings with lawyers and clergy, and then silence. In the United Kingdom, this exact cycle had once been common. Before abolition, inmates waited years under sentence of death, living with constant uncertainty. Investigations later revealed severe psychological damage. Parliament called it inhumane. The death penalty ended in 1965. Canada followed a similar path, arguing that justice could not include irreversible punishment administered by an imperfect system. The United States remained divided. Supporters of the death penalty argued that delays were caused by inmates themselves. Appeals, lawsuits, media pressure. They said the state had the right to carry out sentences without interference. Opponents pointed to survivors. They asked a simple question. If the system can fail once, why trust it again? Behind closed doors, even some officials admitted concern. Internal reports acknowledged difficulties with access, training gaps, drug inconsistencies. But admitting those issues publicly risked stopping executions altogether. So the system adjusted quietly. New methods were introduced. New secrecy laws passed. New execution dates scheduled. For inmates who had already survived once, the message was unmistakable. The next attempt would be different. Faster, more controlled, less visible, and that made it more frightening. Because this time, there would be no room for error. As legal challenges continued and states pushed forward, one final question loomed over death rose across America. If surviving execution does not end your sentence, and stopping an execution does not stop the state, what happens when the system decides it cannot afford to fail again? That answer was coming, and it would change the way executions were carried out forever. The system's resolve became clear in the final years of the 2010s and early 2020s. After every failed execution, states in the United States revised procedures, changed drugs, and limited public oversight. The message to death row inmates was simple: surviving once did not guarantee safety. The state would act again, and it would act with determination. In 2018, Doyleham's case in Alabama drew national attention. He had survived a failed lethal injection attempt due to his illness and difficulty establishing in 4. The execution was halted. He returned to his cell alive, but severely weakened. Lawyers, activists, and medical experts pleaded for mercy, citing the extraordinary suffering he had already endured. Ham eventually died of natural causes, but his ordeal highlighted the harsh reality. Surviving an execution did not erase a death sentence. It only added layers of trauma, uncertainty, and fear. Earlier cases, like Willie Francis in 1946 and Romell Broom in 2009, demonstrated similar patterns. Francis had been executed on the second attempt. Broom survived, but died of natural causes years later. Clayton Lockett's botched 2014 execution in Oklahoma further illustrated that even modern methods were not infallible. Each story shared a common thread. The law treats execution as a technical process, not a moral experience, and surviving it does not free you from its consequences. For inmates, surviving meant living in a suspended state of fear. Each day was colored by the memory of being seconds away from death. Every knock on the door, every shift change, and every announcement of a new execution date became a reminder that the state's authority was absolute. Their existence became defined by anticipation, trauma, and the knowledge that the law was capable of trying again, no matter how many times it had failed before. The legal system has consistently ruled that a failed execution does not invalidate a sentence. Appeals and motions may delay the process, but the ultimate decision rests with the state. This has led to profound ethical and psychological debates. Survivors of execution attempts often face isolation, additional scrutiny, and long-term mental health challenges. What begins as a physical survival turns into a test of endurance, resilience, and the human spirit under unimaginable pressure. These stories are not just historical footnotes. They are ongoing reminders of the complexity and imperfection of the death penalty system in the United States. Unlike Canada or the United Kingdom, where capital punishment has been abolished largely due to concerns over fairness and human rights, the U.S. continues to navigate the tension between law, justice, and the possibility of error. Each failed or survived execution challenges the system to reconcile its authority with human fallibility. Ultimately, surviving an execution raises questions that no court or protocol can fully answer. What does it mean to be sentenced to death when the sentence can fail? How should the law treat someone who has already faced the ultimate punishment and lived? And how does society reconcile the technical efficiency of the state with the human cost of imperfection? These are not easy questions. They touch on morality, justice, and the limits of human control. And as long as the death penalty remains active in the United States, these cases will continue to surface, forcing the public to confront the chilling reality. Surviving an execution does not mean freedom. It means being caught in the darkest, most precarious space between life and death, where fear, law, and humanity collide. The stories of Willie Francis, Romell Broom, Clayton Lockett, and Doyleham remind us that even the most controlled systems are fallible, and the consequences of failure are lived, deeply and painfully, by the human beings at the center of them. Surviving death does not make you safe. It makes you a living testament to the fragility of the system, a reminder that even the law cannot fully control life or death. And so, every time an execution is attempted, the world watches. Every time it fails, we are forced to ask ourselves, how much control does the state truly have? And what price does survival demand from those who live when the law has already decided they should die? The chilling truth remains. For those on death row, survival is not victory. It is a pause, a brief, terrifying window before the inevitable question returns. Will the state try again? The room goes quiet. The lights shine bright. And somewhere, behind glass and steel, someone waits, fully aware that the line between life and death is thinner than anyone can imagine. If you enjoy real, gripping prison documentaries and true stories, don't forget to like this video, leave a comment, and share it with your friends and family. Hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss more shocking and exclusive content.